Happy New Year's, everybody. And boy, do I have a strange bit of news to talk about today. I didn't know how to start 2018, and I wanted to do something special, and then I found something in The Guardian, of all places, that I had to address. I'm not a big fan of The Guardian, so I was quite surprised when I read a recent article about colonialism. If you've seen my past videos, you may remember a video titled A Defense of Bruce Gilley and the Case for Colonialism. If you haven't seen that video, you should go watch that first and then come back here, although you could probably just watch this video and then watch that after, and it should still all make sense. The Guardian, known for their progressive stances, recently published an opinion piece whose title would probably be enough to get demonetized if it were a YouTube video, although what doesn't get demonetized anymore. But anyways, the title of the article is Colonialism Can Work, Just Look at Singapore, written by Jeevan Vasagar. Sorry if I pronounced that wrong. Who, as you may have guessed from the name, is not a white dude. I mean, I really hate to even bring that up because I don't think it has any bearing on the truth of the claim or the validity of the article, but since it was such a widely used criticism against Bruce Gilley, I thought it was worth mentioning. As a quick refresher, back in September 2017, Bruce Gilley, an associate professor of political science at Portland State University, published a paper in Third World Quarterly titled The Case for Colonialism, where he argued that the notion that colonialism is always and everywhere a bad thing needs to be rethought in light of the grave human toll of a century of anti-colonialism regime and policies, which to me is a tacit admission that colonialism was at least sometimes a bad thing. Gilley then gives 3 ways in which to reclaim colonialism, as he puts it. One is for governments and people in developing countries to replicate as far as possible the colonial governance of the past, as successful countries like Singapore, Belize, and Botswana did. A second way is to recolonize some areas. Western countries should be encouraged to hold power in specific governance areas, political finance, say, or criminal justice, in order to jumpstart enduring reform in weak states, rather than speak in euphemisms about shared sovereignty or neo-trustship. Such actions should be called colonialism because it would embrace rather than evade the historical record. Thirdly, in some instances, it may be possible to build new Western colonies from scratch. So basically, Gilley's 3 approaches come down to the countries themselves using the tools of past colonialism gave them, the way Singapore did. Or another way is to do the same things countries like the US are already doing, but instead of making up new terms, rather just call it what it is, which according to Gilley is colonialism. And the third way is to make new colonies from scratch, which to me is the one that sounds sort of the most scary and dangerous since the past is so full of violence and slaughter. But I'll return to that in a moment. To quickly touch on the second approach, countries like the US have significant influence on other countries to the point of sometimes having control over specific state functions. Gilley gives us these examples. The World Bank in the United States, for instance, experimented with co-signatory agreements in Libya and Chad in the 1990s and 2000s where major government expenditures required the signature of both domestic and external agents. In the Australia-led regional assistance missions in Solomon Islands, or the UN's International Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala, key legal and police functions were handed over to external powers because of rampant corruption and criminalization of the state. And then Gilley goes on to explain that while some people like to use terms like cosmopolitan nation building and other euphemisms, these agreements should be called colonialism because it would embrace rather than evade the historical record. And provides a quote that imperialism doesn't stop being necessary just because it becomes politically incorrect. And as for the third method of creating new colonies, which sounds the most dangerous to me because it sounds the most like the colonialism of the past that led to subjugation and death on far too many occasions, Gilley's example, however, gives quite a different impression. In 2009, the economist Paul Romer, who became the World Bank's chief economist in 2016, suggested that rich nations build charter cities in poor countries. Under this model, largely empty land is leased to a foreign nation or group of nations so that their sovereignty allows a modern enclave to grow up, as was the case in Hong Kong. This tidy British colony, according to Romer, did more to reduce world poverty than all the aid programs that we've undertaken in the last century. Okay, so now that we have a good idea of what Gilley's paper was all about, let's take a look at the Guardian article. When talking about Singapore, the article said this. The country's founding prime minister once said that the statue reminds his people of Raffles' vision of Singapore becoming the Emporium of the East, adding that Singapore was different from most other Southeast Asian neighbors because it had no xenophobic hangover from colonialism. It's an attractive story. In the other countries, the end of imperial rule has required a detox regime of new names and new doctrine. Singapore has taken a different path. The Singapore model combines economic liberalism in keeping with Raffles' free trade division, a politics that subordinates the individual to the collective, and effective government. In this version, Singapore offers the best of both worlds, a place where Asian culture tradition remains intact and Western know-how is harnessed to build a prosperous society. Well, okay, I'm definitely not a fan of the whole subordinate the individual to the collective thing, so Singapore doesn't sound like the kind of place I would want to live, but with that being said, no place is perfect, and over time societies change and sometimes improve. So maybe with enough time Singapore will become more individualistic, but either way, its use of political systems and free trade has left the people better off in most cases. But continuing on, When Helen Zyle, a prominent South African opposition politician, visited Singapore last March, she tweeted that there was much to learn from the country that had built on valuable aspects of colonial heritage. She went on, for those claiming legacy of colonialism was only negative, think of our independent judiciary, transport infrastructure, piped water, etc. Zyle is not alone in admiring how Singapore has exploited its imperial inheritance from the strategic location between China and India that Raffles identified to the English language and the English common law system. Its admirers range from Deng Xiaoping to Paul Kagame, Rwanda's president. Unlike some other Asian nations, Singapore does not have a simple story of colonial victimhood. So claiming victim for things that happened in the past rather than moving on and looking forward doesn't actually help people become more prosperous or wealthy, whereas moving forward and using all the tools available to you can actually help improve lives and communities? What a surprise. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying bad shit didn't happen, because obviously it did, but if you want to be successful, you have to be willing to get up and get to work. So those countries that saw the opportunity for capitalism, political institutions, and infrastructure are better off than those that try to avoid these systems and attempt to return to how things used to be before colonialism. But the Singapore story also shows us the price societies pay when the rulers make use of the tools colonial authorities left behind. Under British rule, detention without trial was used to stifle the threat of communism, while a licensed system kept the press contained. As many Singaporean dissidents have argued, Singapore has embraced this illiberal colonial tradition to create a tightly controlled modern state. The consequences are a country that, while wealthy, has its chilling climate for free speech and no independent trade unions. While Singapore does hold elections, there's little space for opposition politics. Human rights groups say defamation laws have frequently been used to silence opposition voices. So clearly Singapore has some issues, and some of those issues have to do with co-opting systems put in place by colonialism, which has left Singapore more authoritarian than I would be comfortable with. Of course, on the one hand, maybe Singapore will become more free from government control over time, but on the other hand, without an environment to uphold freedom of speech, change will be hard to accomplish, because the people in power will likely have the means, motive, and opportunity to silence dissent. But still, I have to wonder if having more discussions about the topic will help lead others to embrace these systems and institutions that lead to greater wealth while avoiding those that lead to overreaching government power. And then the article concludes with this. When Gilley and other like-minded academics endorse colonialism as a model for development, they are, in the end, making the case for a paternal state. Western rule is not required, as Singapore shows, only an openness to modern ideas, which, in the future, will not always come from the West. So as you can see, even though the author is agreeing with some of Gilley's ideas, he does not full-on embrace colonialism. However, in the end, he is, in my opinion, strengthening Gilley's argument. For one, because he agrees that colonialism was ultimately what made Singapore what it is today, but also because his biggest criticism seems to be that while this leads to wealthy nations, it also leads to rather authoritarian ones, which Singapore provides clear evidence of. However, the success, I think, comes from embracing Enlightenment values. For example, the acceptance of free trade has made Singapore quite wealthy, and free trade is individualistic. On the other hand, the politics of Singapore are, as the Guardian article claims, collectivist, which is counter to Enlightenment values. So Singapore's failure comes from embracing bad ideas from colonialism as much as its successes is due to the embrace of good ideas that came from colonialism, such as schools, hospitals, etc. Gilley's paper could have instead been titled The Case for Spreading Enlightenment Values Through Modern Politics and Economic Means, while using the successes and failures of the past as a lens to view our options. But not only would that have been far too lengthy of a title, it ignores an important fact, which is that for all the problems of the past, all the wars, subjugation, brutality, genocide, and death, the past has lessons to teach us, and we must not be afraid to hear those lessons. We have to be willing to critically examine the past and understand the pressures and motives that shape the world we live in today. If we can do that, then I believe we can find innovative new solutions to problems. And if not, then we're doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past. After all, what was the Iraq War but military control of another country by the US? Sounds a little bit like colonialism to me. But maybe if we had learned from our past, we could have avoided the whole situation and saved a great deal of US tax dollars and, more importantly, the lives of soldiers. I personally believe the important part of the values. Singapore has become a wealthy nation because of its embrace of some Enlightenment values, and has failed to become a truly free society because of its failure to fully embrace these values. Of course, these values will not bring anyone to a perfect society, but it will be the very best we can do. The only way to ensure freedom and liberty is to ensure personal responsibility and economic freedom to all individuals and allow for the freedom to speak out against the majority. These ideas, sometimes called Enlightenment values and sometimes called Western values, are the best we've got, and history has shown them to be quite successful. But as the Guardian article points out, Singapore's success is due to an embrace of these ideals, which, in the future, will not always come from the West, which I agree with, and I suspect Gilley would also agree with. Feel free to leave a comment correcting me if I'm wrong, but I don't think Gilley ever suggests colonialism to only be a tool for Westerners. I mean, he is a specialist in the comparative politics in China and Asia, after all. He does argue for Western countries to recolonize, but I suspect that's because Western countries generally embrace Enlightenment values and have the institutions that'll help build successful nations, so these countries will help spread these values and systems. But other countries who also embrace these values may also be effective at helping third world countries become more prosperous, but identifying them would require a detailed list, since such countries tend to be less common in the East. But then again, I'm no psychic, so maybe I'm ascribing my own thoughts onto Gilley's words, and maybe he would disagree with me. I don't really know. So in the end, the Guardian article doesn't fully vindicate Bruce Gilley and his now retracted paper. Some will still argue that it places too great an emphasis on Western countries and Western values, and maybe it does, but it also shows that keeping an open mind and willingness to discuss ideas can get us a lot further than attacking someone's character or strawmanning their arguments. Gilley's paper never called for genocide or violence, and instead asserts that we must reaffirm the primacy of human life, universal values, and shared responsibility. Whether or not colonialism is a valid solution to achieve this goal has yet to be seen, but if we ever want to find an answer, we must be willing to never stop questioning. Thanks for watching. Let's keep the discussion going by leaving a comment, and let me know what you think by rating this video. You can also subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and you can follow me on social media. The links are in the description. Thanks for watching.